They set a chair for the life they wanted me to live, then wondered why I stopped showing up. That was the moment everything changed. Not because of the chair itself, but because of what it whispered every time I walked into my parents' dining room. You're behind. You're incomplete. You should be more by now. For years, I tried to ignore it. Tried to sit through dinners where the questions felt sharper than the knives beside our plates. Tried to pretend that I didn't notice the way my mother's eyes lingered on that extra setting, the polite, quiet pressure disguised as concern. But the truth is, even silence can bruise. Even love, when shaped like expectation, can feel like a cage. I was working, living on my own, building a life in the small ways that mattered to me, yet somehow it was never enough for them. Never the right milestones, the right timeline. And I kept shrinking myself to keep the peace, thinking that maybe if I bent just a little more, they'd finally stop worrying. Then one night, everything broke open, and for the first time, I wasn't the one breaking. This story is about what happened after that moment. How a single dinner unraveled years of unspoken pressure. How a well-meaning family learned to see their daughter without the lens of fear. And how a woman discovered that healing sometimes comes softly. One small boundary, one honest conversation, one unexpected ally at a time. If you've ever felt behind, if you've ever been told your life should look different, or if you've ever carried the quiet weight of someone else's expectations, then stay with me. And before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. I pulled into my parents' driveway, just as the evening air settled into that soft blue hour, the kind that always made their house look gentler than it actually felt. Inside, the dining table was already set, and, of course, the empty chair waited beside mine, like an old ritual no one remembered starting. I placed my bag down, pretending not to notice how intentionally it had been aligned, as if someone were expected to fill it. I gave a polite little laugh, the kind you use when you're smoothing down wrinkles no one else sees. Still, my eyes lingered on that chair longer than they should have, a brief hesitation I hoped my mother didn't catch. The room smelled like rosemary and roasted chicken, everything familiar, everything safe, except the space carved out for someone who wasn't here and had never been. Mom moved around the kitchen with her usual purposeful grace, the kind that made every question sound like a gentle reminder even when it wasn't. "So," she said as she set down the salad, "what are your plans for the future?" Dad, without missing a beat, chimed in with a half-joke about retirement communities or escape plans. He wasn't exactly clear, but it worked as his way of dodging the conversation. The room stayed warm, full of the smells and sounds of home, yet somehow it felt just a little too tight, like a sweater that had shrunk in the wash. It was the kind of closeness that wasn't comfort, just proximity. I took a breath, steadying my voice the way you do before stepping onto thin ice. "I haven't really thought about that," I said. It came out soft, measured, but there was a thin, almost transparent tension running through the words, like fishing line pulled too taut. Mom paused, as if recalculating. Dad stabbed a piece of chicken, pretending to be fascinated by poultry. For a moment, the air thickened. Not hostile, not dramatic, just the quiet pressure of expectations no one wanted to name. I focused on cutting my food, hoping the conversation would slip past me like a breeze, instead of settling on my shoulders. As dinner continued, I found myself scanning the room, the way you do at a gathering where everyone else seems to know the choreography. The family photos, the steady ticking clock, the neatly pressed napkins, everything in its place, except me. It wasn't a sharp feeling, nothing dramatic, more like a small, hollow space just behind the ribs, a sense that everyone else had already stepped into their next chapters, while I was still standing in the hallway, hand on the doorknob. I swallowed the feeling with a sip of water, letting the coolness flatten the ache. I didn't want them to see it. Not tonight. Not ever. The kitchen light glowed in its usual warm gold, the same light that had followed me through childhood dinners, teenage storms, and awkward early adulthood. It was steady, dependable, gentle even. Whenever things felt overwhelming, that light always softened the edges, as if reminding me that some parts of life didn't have to be figured out right away. I let my gaze rest on it for a moment, letting that small comfort settle in my chest. For a brief second, everything felt peaceful again, or at least manageable. Sometimes that was enough. When dinner ended, I pushed my chair back and stood. Just then, the kitchen light flickered. Just once, barely noticeable, but it tugged at me. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the room, like something in the air had changed and was waiting for me to notice. I didn't know why it unsettled me, but I carried that faint feeling with me as I reached for my coat, sensing, without understanding, that something in my life had just taken its first, quiet step toward unfolding. When I unlocked my apartment door, the familiar jingle of Piper's collar was already rushing toward me. She hopped straight into my arms, her small body warm and unapologetically certain that she was the center of my universe. I pressed my face into her fur, letting the soft purr steady the leftover tightness in my chest. It amazed me sometimes, how a creature so tiny could eclipse the echo of someone else's expectations. I kicked off my shoes and padded into the living room, the quiet settling around us in a way that felt chosen, not imposed. I sat on the couch with Piper curled like a comma against my ribs. The day's conversations replayed in fragments, but here, in my own space, they lost their sharpness. If anything, they dissolved into something almost comical. I joked to Piper, "At least you're not asking about my future," and she blinked at me as if to say her only concern was dinner. The next morning at the design studio, Jake spotted me pouring my second cup of coffee and raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess," he said, leaning against the counter. "The ceremonial empty chair dinner?" I groaned into my mug while he grinned like someone who enjoyed being right. "I swear your parents treat that chair like a prophecy," he added. I gave him a small smile, one that didn't quite meet the emotional pitch of his joke. "Something like that." We walked back to our desks, passing the cluster of mood boards pinned with fabric swatches and watercolor palettes. Normally the colors energized me, but today everything looked slightly muted, as if someone had slipped a filter over my vision. Jake glanced my way once more, but didn't push. He had the kind of empathy that showed itself in what he chose not to say. I tried focusing on a client's living room remodel, sketching out lines that should have felt intuitive, soft edges, layered textures, warm earth tones. But my pencil kept stalling mid-stroke, drifting off as if it had a mind of its own. It wasn't the project. It was the lingering question hovering somewhere behind my thoughts. Why did one empty chair feel like a judgment, a reminder, a measurement I hadn't agreed to be held against? I whispered under my breath, "Why am I letting this get to me?" The office hummed with normalcy, printers chattering, phones ringing, someone laughing at a pun in the group chat. Yet I felt a half step out of sync, like music playing slightly off tempo. I stared at the sketch, realizing I'd drawn a dining set, and yes, one empty chair. I erased it quickly, pretending the slip hadn't happened. By the time I clocked out, the weight behind my sternum had turned quiet but persistent, like a small stone in a shoe. I decided to stop by the ice cream shop near my apartment, a habit I'd developed during stressful weeks. The bell over the door chimed as I stepped inside. The place smelled of sugar and nostalgia, equal parts comforting and childish. "Vanilla chip?" the girl behind the counter asked, already reaching for a scoop. I nodded. "You know me too well." She grinned. "Rough day? Or is this a your mom asked about dating again situation?" I let out a sigh that told her she'd nailed it. Her laugh was light, teasing but warm. Moments like this, casual, unceremonious, human, made everything inside me unclench a little. I sat by the window, letting the cold sweetness melt against my tongue while the world outside moved unbothered. When she brought the extra napkins, she always did, she gave me the kind of knowing smile only someone who's watched their own mother rehearse the same script could give. "Hang in there," she said softly. I wiped a stray drip of ice cream from my wrist, feeling the last of my tension slip into something gentler. "You know," I said, stirring the cup with the wooden spoon, "sometimes I think my mom has a sixth sense for when I'm almost relaxed." The girl laughed. "That's literally every mom." I leaned back, letting the everyday simplicity wash over me. It didn't fix anything, but it loosened the knots enough for me to breathe more freely. Somehow, these tiny exchanges made the world feel less heavy, less pointed, just human. I watched the melting streaks of vanilla chip slide slowly down the inside of the cup, a tiny river forming, breaking apart, softening. There was something comforting in the way it surrendered to warmth, how it didn't fight the inevitable, but made it sweeter instead. I rested my chin in my hand and exhaled, feeling the resistance inside me ease just a fraction. Maybe it wasn't about the chair itself. Maybe it was about everything I hadn't said, everything that built up in the quiet spaces between expectations. As the last spoonful disappeared, I tossed the cup and stepped back into the evening light, feeling, if only barely, more like myself again. When I walked into my parents' house that Saturday, something felt off before I even reached the dining room. Maybe it was the way my mother's voice floated from the kitchen, steady but too deliberate. Then I saw it. The empty chair wasn't just waiting this time, it had been set. A knife, fork, and folded napkin sat neatly in front of it, as though an invisible guest were expected at any moment. I froze in the doorway, one hand still on the strap of my bag. The arrangement wasn't accidental, not with how methodical Mom was about table symmetry. I managed a thin smile. "We're hosting someone?" Mom turned with a bright, suspiciously casual expression. Dad lifted his brows like even he wasn't sure how to defend this new development. The room hummed with a strange anticipation, as if the chair itself had gained a heartbeat. Mom wiped her hands on a dish towel and set it lightly, as if announcing a weather update. "There's a young man I'd like you to meet, a coworker's nephew, very polite." Dad nodded in a way that made it unclear whether he agreed or simply thought agreeing was easier. I glanced again at the meticulously set place. The details were almost too thoughtful. Folded napkin, straightened silverware, a glass placed at just the right angle. It was funny in a way that wasn't actually funny at all. Mom had turned the abstract pressure into decor. I could feel something inside me stiffen. Not anger, not yet, but the early tremor of being nudged into a story I didn't write. Dad cleared his throat, pretending to rearrange the salt shaker, like maybe if he kept his hands busy he wouldn't have to take a side. I pulled out my chair, sat down, and tried to keep my tone light. "Mom, you're decorating a suggestion." For a split second I saw a flicker of amusement in her eyes, then it vanished. "I'm just being thoughtful," she said. "Presentation matters." Somehow that made it worse. I picked up my water glass to steady myself. "I appreciate it, but I'm not—" She cut in softly, not unkindly. "A mother worries, and opportunities don't always come twice." It wasn't the words, it was the quiet certainty behind them, as if she'd already mapped out decisions I hadn't made yet. Across the table, Dad offered me a half smile that said, "I know, kid, I really do." But he didn't say anything, and silence has a weight all its own. As conversation moved on, I tried to follow along, but everything felt misaligned, like a picture frame hung a degree too high. Mom talked about the neighbor's garden. Dad mentioned a coworker who microwaved fish in the break room. Ordinary topics, harmless topics. And yet, beneath each sentence I felt the earlier comment pressing against me like a thumb bruise. The idea that my life needed arranging. That I needed arranging. A memory flickered. Me at 17, standing in the hallway with a college brochure in hand. Mom urging a safer major instead of the one I loved. Not cruelly, just insistently, persuasively. I blinked the thought away before it could sharpen. This was dinner, not a battlefield. Still, something small inside me recoiled, like it had been touched in the same old tender place. The meal unfolded in its familiar rhythm, passing dishes, bumping knees under the table, the occasional soft laugh. But there was an invisible layer between us tonight, thin as glass, yet impossible to ignore. Every clink of utensils felt slightly louder. Every pause felt slightly longer. At one point, Dad reached for the pepper grinder and accidentally tapped his fork against his plate. The tiny sound echoed, sharp in the quiet. I realized my shoulders had tensed, as though waiting for something unspoken to surface. The evening wasn't hostile, it was crowded, with expectations, assumptions, hopes I didn't ask to carry. The chair beside me sat there, filled with a story someone else was trying to write on my behalf. And the worst part was how familiar that feeling was. As I gathered my dishes after dinner, the air felt too still, as if it were holding its breath. Something was shifting beneath the surface, preparing to rise. Slow, quiet, inevitable. I stacked the plates, trying to anchor myself in the simple motion, but my thoughts kept circling back to the way Mom hadn't laughed at my joke earlier. She always laughed, even when I wasn't funny. Tonight she didn't. Dad wiped the counter with exaggerated precision, clearly sensing the undercurrent but choosing the safety of silence. I felt suspended between wanting to let it go and wanting to call it out. And in that small, suspended space, I sensed the path ahead of me bending, subtly, unmistakably, toward something I wasn't ready to name yet. Mom didn't circle around it this time. As soon as the plates were cleared, she reached into the drawer by the fridge and placed a small yellow memo on the table, right in front of me. "Next week," she said, her voice careful. "Bring someone. Anyone you're getting to know." The note was brief, just a date and a time, but it struck with the quiet force of something much bigger. For a moment, I just stared at it. The handwriting was her neat looping script, the same she used to label leftovers or leave reminders on the bathroom mirror. But this was no harmless reminder. I felt the room tilt just a little. Not enough to make me lose balance, just enough to make standing still suddenly difficult. Mom watched me with a hopeful sort of insistence, like she'd offered me a gift. But it wasn't a gift at all. I looked over at the chair again, as though confirming it hadn't moved. Somehow it looked different now. Its neat table setting no longer symbolic, but literal. Expectant. A chair once used as a subtle hint had turned into a requirement, an assignment I'd never agreed to complete. My chest tightened with a strange mix of disbelief and inevitability. Dad tried to lighten the moment with a small shrug. "Your mother loves themes," he joked weakly. "Maybe this is dinner decor?" But Mom didn't even smile. The message was unmistakable. Fill the seat, fill the role, fill the timeline she feared I was falling behind. I felt my breath catch in my throat, the room shrinking around the edges like it was folding inward. The pressure wasn't subtle anymore. It had been placed directly in my hands. "Mom," I said quietly, "you can't just assign me a deadline." She folded her arms, the gesture soft but firm, like she believed she was protecting me from something I couldn't see. "I'm not assigning anything," she said. "I'm helping you." The disconnect between her intention and its impact hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. "I'm not ready," I added. My voice sounded steady even though my pulse stumbled. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line. "You never think you're ready. Sometimes you need a push." Dad took a half step toward us, then paused, caught between wanting to intervene and knowing he wouldn't. The air tightened again, not loud or dramatic, just controlled, like someone slowly turning a knob on a pressure valve. I felt something inside me brush against an old bruise. A memory of sitting at the dining table years ago, brochures for college programs spread out like menus. I'd wanted design. Mom had wanted business. "It's more stable," she'd said, tapping the brochure like it was a moral truth. It wasn't that she wanted to hurt me. She just believed she knew better. Tonight felt like that all over again, the subtle rewriting of my choices into hers. The memory slipped through me like a thin cut, not deep enough to bleed, but sharp enough to sting. I tried to breathe past it, but the weight of déjà vu pulled tight across my ribs. I wondered if she saw me as someone capable of steering my own life, or just someone she had to shepherd toward her idea of safety. Dad reached for his fork but knocked it gently against the plate, creating a small metallic sound that lingered longer than it should have. The silence afterward was strange, like a room clearing after a performance, except the performance hadn't ended yet. Mom sat down across from me, her expression softening, but not enough to undo what she'd said. "We just want you to be happy." It was a sentence that carried its own type of weight, the kind that assumes happiness only comes in one shape, one timeline, one chair already waiting at the table. I rubbed my thumb along the edge of the memo to ground myself, its paper thin but solid. Nothing about this moment felt openly hostile, but it had the density of something unacknowledged, something quietly demanding. I slid the note back toward her, but it trembled under the faint breeze from the ceiling fan, making it seem alive for a second, like it was resisting being returned. "I can't promise you that," I said softly. Mom inhaled sharply, as though my refusal had knocked the air out of the room. Dad looked between us, helpless in the most familiar way. For a brief moment, no one moved. It felt like we were all suspended in the tight, delicate space between intention and impact. I stood slowly, gathering my things. My heart wasn't pounding, just steady. Steady in the way a boundary feels when it starts forming for the first time. I didn't look back at the chair, but I could feel it behind me, waiting, the weight of expectations settling into its wood. While washing dishes with Mom, steam rising between us like a quiet curtain, I tried one more time to soften the edges. "Mom," I said gently, handing her a rinsed plate, "you can't push me into something I'm not ready for." I kept my tone low, not confrontational, just steady, the way you speak when you're trying to meet someone in the middle. She took the plate, dried it with slow, deliberate movements. For a second, I thought she might meet me halfway. But then she said, almost too softly, "You think I'm pushing, Claire, but I'm trying to keep you from losing time." The words drifted in the warm kitchen air, settling somewhere just below my ribs. I didn't want to argue. I wanted her to understand. Yet it felt like we were speaking adjacent languages, not quite reaching each other. The faucet kept running, steady as a sigh. Mom added, "I look at you, and I worry. I don't want you waking up one day regretting what you didn't choose." Her voice wasn't sharp. That almost made it worse. It carried fear more than pressure, but fear can push just as hard. I set a bowl aside and stared at the soap bubbles clinging to my fingers. "Le thầy." I could hear the phrase even if she didn't say it out loud this time. I turned off the tap long enough to really look at her. She was trying, in her way, but intention didn't erase impact. The kitchen's warmth suddenly felt too close, like the air had thickened between us. A conversation meant for comfort had twisted itself into something tight and fragile. I breathed in, slow and deep. "Mom, I want to choose what's right for me, not what's fast, not what's convenient for other people." She said nothing, not out of agreement, but out of a silence that carried its own verdict. It was the worst kind of quiet, the kind that pretends to give space but actually creates distance. She placed the dish towel on the counter and walked to the pantry, her movements neat and controlled, like she needed to do something with her hands to avoid doing something with her heart. I felt a small, tired ache settle low in my chest. Every gentle word I'd tried felt like it slid right off the surface, leaving no mark. Some battles don't explode, they dissolve, slow and painful. I stepped out of the kitchen, needing air. Dad stood in the hallway, halfway hidden by the doorway, as though he'd come to intervene but backed out at the last second. Our eyes met. He lifted his hand a little, like he wanted to offer something, comfort, alliance, an apology, but didn't know which. Then he lowered it again. He wasn't choosing sides, he simply didn't know how. I gave him a small, weary smile. "It's fine, Dad," I said, even though it wasn't. He nodded, relieved to be let off the hook, not realizing that his relief only made the moment feel more lopsided. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being the only one willing to name a problem. It isn't dramatic, just steady and quiet, like a slow leak in the walls. I grabbed my sweater from the armchair in the living room, the fabric still faintly smelling of home and something older. Memories, comfort, expectation. Mom stayed in the kitchen, the soft shuffle of her movements drifting through the doorway. Dad retreated to the living room, switching on the news like a man hiding behind sound. I paused at the threshold, hoping, maybe foolishly, that Mom would call after me. That she'd say, "Wait, let's talk again. I heard you this time." But the kitchen stayed silent. Not angry, just closed. I swallowed the sting and slipped my sweater on, feeling its weight settle on my shoulders like a quiet reminder that warmth doesn't always come from where you expect it. I closed the front door behind me gently, not wanting the sound to feel like an ending, even though, in some small way, it was. The evening air brushed against my cheeks, calmer than the house I'd just left. As I walked toward my car, I realized I carried a strange sense of defeat. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft, tired recognition that trying to be gentle had gotten me nowhere. It wasn't resentment, more like resignation. Sometimes, no matter how softly you speak, the person listening only hears what they fear. I sat behind the wheel, resting my forehead on the steering wheel for a long moment before turning the key. Tonight had ended exactly the way I'd hoped it wouldn't. Emma was already seated by the window when I arrived at the cafe, her hair pulled into a loose bun that somehow made her look both casual and perceptive. She lifted her cup in greeting as I slid into the seat across from her. "You look emotionally rumpled," she said. I huffed a small laugh. "That obvious?" The warmth from my latte fogged my glasses slightly, blurring the edges of the world. It felt strangely fitting. I wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the heat soak into my palms. "So," she said, leaning forward, "how bad was it this time?" And just like that, the tightness I'd been carrying since dinner loosened. Here, I didn't need to translate my feelings or brace for misunderstanding. I could just be. I told her everything. The set place at the table, the note, the forced gentleness in Mom's voice. Emma listened with her eyebrows inching higher until she finally said, "That's not concern. That's pressure dressed up as concern." I let out a laugh that felt too brittle to be real. She thinks she's helping. Emma took a slow sip of her drink. "Intentions don't cancel impact, Claire. You know that." Hearing someone else say it dissolved a piece of the doubt I'd been holding. I stared at the swirl of foam in my cup, watching it collapse into itself. "I shouldn't feel this heavy, right? It's just dinner." Emma shook her head. "It's not dinner. It's being told you're not enough as you are." Her words landed in a place I'd been avoiding, a place where truth sits uncomfortably but stubbornly. I exhaled. "I felt disrespected," I said quietly. Saying it out loud surprised me with how much it hurt, like my choices don't count unless they match hers. Emma's expression softened. "That's not small, Claire." I pressed my lips together, letting the truth settle. "I don't think she means to hurt you," she continued, "but she's doing it anyway." I nodded, feeling something loosen and tighten at the same time. "It's strange," I said. "I'm a grown woman, but sometimes she talks to me like I'm still 15, incapable of steering my own life." Emma reached across the table and tapped my wrist gently. Then maybe it's time you steer louder. Her touch wasn't dramatic, just a grounding point. It made me feel seen, something I hadn't felt at home in a while. I stared out the cafe window at the passing cars, each one heading somewhere with a purpose I envied. I keep trying to be patient, I admitted, to understand where she's coming from, but all that patience just circles back and hits me again. Emma tilted her head. Patience isn't the same as silence, and silence isn't the same as peace. The sentence lingered between us, soft but weighty. For the first time in days, my breath came a little easier. Being honest, actually honest, had peeled away a layer of exhaustion I didn't realize I was wearing. I leaned back in my chair, letting the cafe's low hum settle into something steady. A beam of afternoon light slipped through the window, catching the metal edge of the table and reflecting a small glimmer onto my hand. It flickered for a second, a tiny shimmer that felt like a quiet nudge. Nothing dramatic, just a gentle reminder that clarity often arrives in small bursts. I traced the rim of my cup, feeling a mix of vulnerability and release. Emma watched me carefully. What are you thinking? That maybe I've been trying to minimize how much this hurt, I said. And maybe that's why it keeps hurting. She nodded as if she'd been waiting for me to admit it. You don't have to be the reasonable one all the time, she said. You're allowed to react. You're allowed to stand up. Hearing that settled deeper than I expected. As the conversation drifted into softer topics, work gossip, Piper's latest antics, I felt an unexpected spark of resolve beneath the lingering ache. A small idea was forming at the edges of my thoughts, half-formed and slightly absurd, but delicious in a way that made my pulse quicken. Not revenge, not rebellion, just a reclaiming. Emma must have noticed the change in my face because she raised an eyebrow. You're thinking something, she said. Maybe, I replied, letting a slow smile pull at my lips. Whatever the idea was becoming, it carried a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in a long time. For now, I let it sit quietly inside me, warming like a secret. When I got home that evening, the hallway of my apartment building smelled faintly of paint and old carpet, a strangely comforting scent I'd grown used to. I turned the corner and found Mr. Harold crouched on one knee, wrestling with a stubborn wrench under the sink in the shared utility closet. Piper darted out of my apartment the moment she saw him, and began winding around his legs like he'd come specifically to visit her. Well, hello to you too, he chuckled, giving her a gentle scratch behind the ears. I leaned against the doorframe. You always show up right when something around here needs fixing. Lucky timing, he said, though the way he grunted at the pipe suggested it wasn't luck at all, but his persistent determination not to let age slow him down. Watching him work, steady and unhurried, nudged something loose in my mind. A spark, small but bright. When he finally stood, wiping his hands on a rag, I teased. If you were 30 years younger, I'd take you straight to my parents' house just to see them panic. He let out a laugh so hearty it echoed off the hallway walls. And here I thought my charm was timeless. Trust me, I said, smirking. You'd still cause a stir. What surprised me wasn't the joke itself. It was the flicker of an idea that burst awake as soon as the words left my mouth. Not a fully formed plan, not even a real intention. More like a whispered dare. The thought that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to respond to all the pressure. A way that didn't involve another silent dinner or another folded note on the kitchen table. Mr. Harold rummaged in his toolbox for a small mint tin he always carried. He popped it open and held it toward me. Peppermint? I accepted one, because I always did. I swear, I said, unwrapping it, you're single-handedly responsible for keeping my stress levels from detonating. He smiled with the kind of ease that comes only from age and a lifetime of not needing to impress anyone. Something clicked then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet realization. The grace he carried in everyday life was exactly the kind of energy I needed right now. The softness, the humor, the grounded presence. For a moment, I imagined him sitting at my parents' dinner table, legs crossed, thanking my mother for the casserole. The image was so absurd I nearly choked on the mint. He noticed the look on my face. "What's going on in that head of yours?" "Nothing," I said quickly, waving a hand. "Absolutely nothing good." "That's usually when the best ideas happen," he replied. I laughed, but inside, the small spark brightened. He handed me a folded flyer for the community garden event he volunteered at. "Tell your folks an old guy like me can still outwork half the younger ones." I shook my head. "You'd terrify them in the best way." His eyes twinkled with the mischief of someone who enjoyed harmless chaos. "Anytime you need backup, kiddo," he said. "I'm around." It was meant casually, but the words burrowed somewhere deeper. Backup. Support. A choice that was mine to make, not handed to me on a yellow memo. Piper brushed against my ankle, as if nudging me towards some truth I hadn't fully acknowledged yet. I glanced back at Harold, sturdy, kind, unapologetically himself, and I felt a slow, rebellious warmth curl through me. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was humor, but maybe it was something else, too. The first real sense of control I'd felt in weeks. I watched him gather his tools, humming a tune from some decade my parents still called the good old days. And in that very ordinary hallway, beneath flickering fluorescent lights, the idea sharpened. Not to deceive, not to hurt, but to reclaim the narrative. My narrative. In a way only I could. As he walked off, toolbox clinking, he tossed a final look over his shoulder. "Don't let anyone box you in, Claire. Life's too short." The sentence landed with surprising weight, echoing after he disappeared around the corner. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, mint dissolving slowly on my tongue, Piper purring at my feet. The idea that had been forming wasn't polished or responsible, or even fully sane, but it felt undeniably mine. I unlocked my door, stepping back inside with a shift in my chest I hadn't felt in a very long time. Something like agency. Something like defiance. Something like breath. Whatever came next, I wouldn't be walking into it quietly. I didn't give myself time to overthink it, because if I had, I would have talked myself out of the entire plan. When Harold showed up at my door that evening, wearing a neatly pressed shirt and holding a small bouquet of grocery store flowers, "They were on sale," he whispered with a wink. I nearly lost my nerve. "You ready, kiddo?" he asked, offering me his arm like some old-fashioned gentleman from a black and white film. Was I ready? Absolutely not. But I looped my arm through his anyway, because something about his steady presence made the whole thing feel less like chaos, and more like possibility. On the drive to my parents' house, Harold practiced polite lines. "Lovely home. Thank you for having me," with a seriousness that almost made me laugh out loud. By the time we pulled into the driveway, my heart was beating in my throat. The moment we stepped inside, Mom froze mid-stir of her soup, the ladle dangling in the air like it had forgotten gravity. "This is Harold," I said calmly, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "The new, important person in my life." The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as tension. Dad stood up so quickly his chair scraped the floor. His face shifted through several expressions, confusion, disbelief, mild panic, before landing on something like forced politeness. Harold, bless him, bowed slightly. "Thank you for welcoming me." Mom blinked once, twice. "Of course." I couldn't tell if she was breathing. Harold offered her the bouquet, and she accepted it with hands that looked suspiciously unsteady. The room felt like it had tipped forward onto its toes, waiting to see what would happen next. We moved toward the table, and Harold, committed to the performance with award-winning dedication, pulled out the very chair that had caused all this turmoil. He sat with such confidence you'd think he'd been attending family dinners with us for decades. Mom's eyes flicked from him to me, searching for logic like a person frantically checking a map in a foreign city. "So," Dad started cautiously, "how did you two meet?" "At the sink," Harold said cheerfully. "She liked my wrench." I choked on air. He corrected himself quickly. "I mean, she admired my plumbing skills." Dad's eyebrows shot up. Mom's lips parted. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief, exactly, but a delicious kind of mischief that melted some of the old wound. I explained with a perfectly straight face. He was fixing a leak in the utility closet, and we just connected. Dad's expression twitched, a mix between concern and bewilderment. Mom looked at Harold as if trying to calculate his age, and losing track somewhere in the 50s. Still, she managed a tight smile. "Well, it's wonderful you're here." Harold beamed at her with the world's most polite enthusiasm. The absurdity of the situation pulsed under the surface like soft, offbeat music only I could hear. I reached down to smooth the napkin on my lap, grounding myself. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't rebellion. It was reclaiming the script. A sideways, ridiculous, harmless reclaiming. And watching my parents scramble to process it was a balm I hadn't known I needed. Dinner unfolded like a play where no one had memorized their lines. Dad kept clearing his throat as if trying to find an appropriate response to all of this. Mom alternated between offering Harold more potatoes and staring at me like she was waiting for the punchline. Harold handled every moment with disarming charm. "This meal is wonderful," he said sincerely. "It's been years since I've had such a nice family dinner." Mom's fork paused mid-air. Dad blinked rapidly. I sipped my water to hide a smile. No one was arguing. No one was pushing me. No notes, no deadlines, no expectations. Just a bizarre, tender chaos that somehow felt more honest than anything we'd had in weeks. At one point, Harold lifted his spoon too quickly, and it clinked sharply against the soup bowl, a small metallic sound that seemed to slice through the room. Everyone jumped. The silence that followed was so taut it almost vibrated. Harold whispered, "Oops," like a child caught sneaking candy. Dad inhaled sharply. Mom's grip tightened on her napkin. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension peak, then shimmer, delicate and inevitable. Something had cracked open tonight, whether any of us were ready or not. The evening was absurd, awkward, and absolutely imperfect. But it was also the first time in a long while that the balance of power didn't feel stacked against me. And that tiny shift, barely visible, barely audible, felt like the beginning of something larger. Dinner moved forward in a strange, stumbling rhythm, like a play where every actor kept forgetting what scene they were in. Harold, to his credit, behaved like the most well-mannered guest imaginable. He complimented the cooking, asked polite questions, and nodded thoughtfully at answers, even the vague ones. It should have calmed the room. Instead, it heightened the tension in a way that felt almost comical. Dad kept glancing at me, then at Harold, then back at me, as though trying to decode a message written in a dialect he'd never studied. Mom's eyes darted toward the chair, toward the table setting she'd so carefully arranged earlier, now occupied by a reality she clearly hadn't rehearsed for. The whole dinner felt like an elaborate improv game gone slightly off the rails, and somehow that was the most relaxed I'd felt here in weeks. Mom attempted small talk, her voice too bright, too thin. "So, Harold, what do you do in your free time?" He smiled warmly. "Mostly community gardening, and fixing things around the building. Pipes, leaks, the occasional clogged disposal." Dad stopped chewing mid-bite. "Disposals?" Harold nodded. "Oh yes, nothing brings people together like a kitchen emergency." Mom's lips parted, unsure whether to laugh or grimace. I watched her trying desperately to connect the dots. My mother, who could spot a stain across a room but couldn't see past her own expectations at this table. I caught her eye and held it for a second, silently saying, "This is what happens when you try to script my life." She looked away first. When Dad asked how we met, I repeated the story, simple and truthful in its framework, outrageous in its implication. At the utility closet, I said. He was fixing the pipes. It was a moment. Dad choked slightly on his water. Harold, unbothered, patted his arm. Don't worry, sir. Nothing scandalous. Just a broken valve and a helpful young lady. Mom blinked rapidly, like she was buffering. I felt a bubble of laughter rise in me, but it wasn't cruel. It was relief. A tiny rebellion blooming quietly inside the chaos. It struck me how surreal this all was. A simple act of shifting the script had turned the whole room into a space they couldn't control. And oddly, that made the room feel more breathable for me. Under the table, Piper, who had come with us because I didn't trust leaving her alone during a night like this, curled up beside Harold's feet. He stroked her head gently with the side of his shoe, creating a soft, rhythmic motion that steadied the air around us. Lovely cat, he murmured. Mom's mouth twitched, halfway between approval and bafflement. Dad poured himself more water than anyone reasonably needed. I took in the scene, the steaming dishes, the awkward smiles, the tiny absurdities, and felt a surprising tenderness rise in me. Not toward the situation, but toward myself. I'd spent so much time bending, accommodating, smoothing. Tonight, for once, I hadn't bent at all, and the world hadn't shattered. It had simply rearranged. The scent of warm soup lingered in the air, mingling with the low hum of the refrigerator. Yet beneath it all, something hotter simmered, unspoken truths pressing softly against the cracks of the evening. Mom stared at her bowl, then lifted her gaze to me, eyes filled with more questions than she could phrase. Dad kept shifting in his seat, as though trying to adjust to a new gravitational field. Harold, blissfully unaware of the emotional landmines around him, or maybe simply too gracious to mind, ate his soup with genuine appreciation. I watched my parents wrestle silently with their assumptions, their hopes, their disbelief. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel weighed down by any of it. I felt anchored in myself instead. As the spoons dipped and clinked against ceramic, a single sharp sound cut through the room. A tiny metallic note that made everyone pause mid-motion. Harold looked up with an apologetic smile. A bit louder than I intended. Mom inhaled slowly, Dad exhaled too quickly, and a delicate silence settled over the table like a thin veil. In that quiet, I felt the full weight of what I'd done, and the strange lightness of it too. This dinner was a disruption, yes, a shock, absolutely. But it was also a truth. I was done living inside someone else's expectation. And sitting there, watching the room absorb that truth in real time, I felt a certainty begin to form inside me. Steady, quiet, unmistakable. When Harold excused himself early, claiming an uncharacteristic burst of social fatigue, he did so with a gentle smile and a bow polite enough to stun both my parents into complete stillness. I believe I've broken a record for quiet dinners, he whispered to me at the door. Call me if you need reinforcements. I thanked him, genuinely touched, then returned to the kitchen. Mom stood by the counter. Dad hovered by the stove. The three of us formed a silent triangle, the kind that carried too much meaning and absolutely no clarity. No one seemed to know which version of the evening to address, the absurdity or the ache beneath it. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other, none of us brave enough to speak first. The quiet wasn't cruel, just suspended, waiting. Dad finally broke the stillness by adjusting a stack of plates that didn't need adjusting. He shifted them once, twice, then stopped mid-motion when Mom shot him a look. The kitchen felt smaller with just the three of us, as though the walls had leaned in to witness what came next. Mom's hands shook slightly as she wiped the counter with a dish towel she didn't need. Dad cleared his throat. Well, he said, that was different. I nodded, folding my arms loosely across my chest. You wanted the chair filled. Mom turned toward me sharply, but her voice came out quieter than her expression. Not like that, Claire. Her tone wasn't angry, just strained, like she was trying to hold the shape of something that kept slipping through her fingers. I took a breath, slow and steady. I thought I was giving you what you wanted. Mom blinked, the words catching her off guard. Dad rubbed the back of his neck, guilt flickering across his face like a shadow. We didn't mean for you to feel forced. I almost laughed, not mockingly, but in disbelief. You set the table for a ghost and handed me a deadline. Mom's lips pressed together, trembling at the edges. We were worried about you. The sentence hovered in the room, heavy and familiar. But tonight, for the first time, I wasn't absorbing it quietly. I let it land where it belonged, in the space between intention and consequence. A boundary forming, thin but firm. The kitchen light flickered, briefly brighter, then settling back into its warm glow. Mom looked up at it, startled, as if the house itself had offered commentary. I didn't move. I didn't soften. You can be worried, I said gently, but you can't shape my life around your fear. Dad exhaled, slow and heavy, as though he'd been holding something in for years. Mom's shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in realization. A crack, a small shift. She sank onto a stool at the counter. You blindsided us, she said, but her tone lacked its earlier tightness. I nodded. So did you. The honesty stung, but it felt necessary, like alcohol on a wound. Dad leaned against the fridge, arms folded, his face softer than before. We just want you to be happy, truly. I know, I said. But happiness doesn't come from filling a chair. Not for me. Mom swallowed. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. I didn't realize how much pressure I was putting on you. The tension in her shoulders eased, not gone, but no longer bracing for impact. The room softened around us. The air felt less like a storm and more like the quiet afterward, when leaves are still trembling but the wind has passed. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a first step toward it. Dad walked into the pantry, searching for something, or maybe just needing a moment out of the spotlight. Mom stayed seated, fingers woven tightly in her lap. I watched her inhale, long and slow, before speaking. I know you meant well, I said, but I need you to trust me, to trust my timing. She nodded, barely, but it was a nod. The kitchen felt different now, shifted a few degrees away from control and closer to understanding. Even the light above us hummed quieter, as though settling into a new rhythm. We stood at the beginning of something uncomfortable but honest, finally facing each other without the weight of an empty chair dictating the room. Dad was the one who spoke first, though his voice barely rose above a murmur. You're making this family look careless, Claire. The words weren't loud, but they cut with a quiet precision that surprised even him. He winced the moment they slipped out. I let the silence sit between us for a beat before answering. I felt that way for years, I said. Not dramatic, not sharp, just honest. Dad froze, like I'd reached into a drawer he'd kept locked for decades. In that moment, I saw something rare flicker across his face, an expression unguarded, almost vulnerable. He opened his mouth to speak, but didn't. His jaw tightened instead, as though he wasn't sure which part of the truth he was supposed to respond to. Mom stepped forward, but her voice trembled. Claire, honey, why didn't you tell us earlier? I didn't laugh, though part of me wanted to. Tell you what? I asked gently. That I felt unheard? That decisions were being made for me without asking? She flinched, not because the words were cruel, but because they were true. Dad shifted his weight, clearing his throat like he wanted to speak, but needed more time to find the right tone. The air felt heavy, the kind of heaviness that comes not from anger, but from realizing you've missed something important for far too long. Mom's eyes glistened, and she blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. "Why didn't you just say something?" she whispered again, softer this time. "Would it have mattered?" I asked. Not accusatory, just a question that had lived inside me for years. Mom opened her mouth, but no words came out. Dad looked away, guilt creeping into the lines around his eyes. I continued quietly. I tried hinting. I tried being patient, but patience doesn't work if no one's listening. Mom hugged herself lightly, like she needed her own arms for support. For a moment, the room felt like a confession booth. Dim, intimate, fragile. Dad finally spoke. We didn't know you felt this strongly." "I didn't know how to say it stronger," I replied, the admission pulling something tight and tender from the center of my chest. The kitchen's small sounds suddenly felt amplified. The low hum of the refrigerator, the slow beat of our collective breathing. Mom pressed a hand to her cheek. "I just wanted you safe, Claire. I wanted your life to be full." "I know," I said softly, "but it's hard to feel full when someone else keeps serving the portions." Her shoulders dropped, the weight of the metaphor not lost on her. Dad stepped toward me, stopping just short, as though crossing that distance required more vulnerability than he'd practiced. "We didn't mean to shut you out," he said. "But you did," I answered, gentle but firm. His eyes closed briefly, acknowledging the truth without defense. No one moved for a long moment. Then Mom whispered, "Tell us what you need." Her voice was so quiet it almost disappeared into the air. I took a breath, steady, grounding. "I need you to stop assuming I'm falling behind," I said. "I need you to see that I'm not unfinished just because my life doesn't look like yours." Mom nodded slowly, each motion deliberate, as though she were absorbing each word one by one. Dad rested a hand on the edge of the counter, steadying himself. "We hear you," he said. It wasn't a promise, but it was acknowledgement, something we hadn't had in a long time. The faint whir of the ceiling fan swept through the room, carrying the tension with it. Mom wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Dad exhaled a breath he'd held too long. I felt something shift. Not resolve, not forgiveness, but the first fragile inch of recognition. It wasn't harmony yet, but it was a moment of clarity, shared among three people who had been orbiting each other without truly seeing. We didn't hug, we didn't smile. We just stood in a silence that, for the first time, felt honest instead of heavy. And in that quiet, I understood something. Sometimes the breaking isn't the ending. Sometimes it's the beginning of finally being understood. Mom sat down slowly, as if her legs had run out of instructions. Her hands trembled when she reached for mine, but I pulled back. Not harshly, just enough to show there were things we couldn't skip past. She inhaled, steadying herself. "I worry about you being lonely, Claire." Her voice cracked on the last word. The kitchen lights cast soft shadows across her face, making her look older than I ever allowed myself to notice. "I'm not lonely," I said gently. "Tired, maybe, but not lonely." She searched my expression, trying to reconcile the image she had built of me with the woman sitting in front of her now. One who wasn't folding, wasn't nodding, wasn't trying to keep the peace. For the first time tonight, she seemed unsure of her footing, as though she had stepped into a room she thought she knew and found the furniture rearranged. Dad leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, not defensively, but like a man bracing for a truth he knew was long overdue. "We've seen you coming home alone for years," Mom continued quietly. "Eating dinner by yourself, spending holidays with us but leaving early. Of course we worried." I swallowed hard. Worrying is one thing, deciding I need fixing is another. She startled slightly at the word fixing. Dad's eyes softened. "Your mother didn't mean it like that." I didn't look away. But that's how it felt. The honesty stretched between us, raw and unpolished. No one tried to patch it with excuses this time. Mom clasped her hands together, her wedding ring turning under her thumb, a small nervous gesture she'd never admit to. "I didn't realize," she whispered. "I truly didn't." "I'm tired," I admitted. The words left me before I could soften them. "I'm tired of feeling like something's wrong with me because I'm not living the way you imagined." Mom's eyes glistened again. She blinked rapidly, the way she did when she was trying not to break. Dad shifted his weight, his shoulders drooping with a quiet grief. "We thought we were helping." I looked down, tracing a small line on the counter with my fingertip. "Help shouldn't hurt." The room stilled, heavy, intimate, almost sacred in its vulnerability. For the first time, I felt like we were speaking without armor. No polite smiles, no softened edges, just the truth, placed carefully on the table between us, fragile and whole. Mom swallowed hard before saying, "I didn't know it weighed on you this much." Her voice trembled, not from anger, but from something closer to fear and regret. "There were nights I couldn't sleep," I said. "Not because I was alone, but because I felt like you thought I was failing." Mom pressed her fingers to her lips, the gesture small and shaking. Dad bowed his head, a man reckoning with the unintended cost of his silence. None of us moved for several seconds. It felt like standing in the eye of a storm, not calm exactly, but suspended, the world holding its breath around us. And in that suspension, a truth I had carried alone for years finally found air. One tear slipped down Mom's cheek before she could stop it. She looked at me with a kind of apology that didn't need words. "I hurt you," she murmured. I didn't respond right away. We weren't ready to rush this moment. Finally, I said, "You didn't mean to, but yes." She nodded, taking the truth in with a courage I hadn't expected. Dad stepped closer, resting his hand lightly on the back of a chair, not touching me, not touching her, but grounding himself. He cleared his throat. We need to do better." For the first time in a long time, I believed him. A single drop of water fell from the dish towel Mom had forgotten she was holding, landing on the wooden floor with a soft, delicate sound. No one reacted, but we all heard it. It felt like something tiny and unspoken had broken open. A small release, a small truth finding space. I breathed in, feeling the sharpness in my chest ease by degrees. Mom wiped her face. Dad looked at me as though seeing me not as someone to protect or direct, but simply as his daughter, grown, imperfect, whole. We stood in a kitchen that suddenly felt different, as if the air itself had shifted into honesty. A fragile beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. I took a slow breath before speaking again, my voice steady but stripped of the usual softness I used to hide behind. "That chair made me feel like I was extra, like there was a part of my life missing that you were trying to fill for me." Mom's face crumpled, not into anger but into something closer to heartbreak. Dad stepped back, bumping lightly into the counter as though my words had pushed him. "I didn't know you carried it like that," Mom whispered. "It wasn't the chair itself," I said. "It was everything it stood for. It made me feel like I was disappointing you just by being who I am right now." Saying it aloud was like opening a window in a room that had been shut for years, letting in air that felt strange at first, but necessary. Dad's hand gripped the back of the chair as if he needed something solid to hold on to. "I didn't realize," he murmured, the words barely forming. Mom covered her mouth with her fingers, her breath hitching. "We thought we were nudging you, not hurting you." A humorless smile pulled at my lips. "The line between nudging and pushing is thinner than you think." Mom lowered her hand, eyes shining. "We've always wanted you to be happy, Claire. To have a full life, a good life." "I know," I said quietly. "But fullness shouldn't come from fear. And love shouldn't feel like an obligation I'm failing to meet." Mom closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the truth like a long overdue medicine, bitter but healing. The room shifted into a different kind of quiet, one not shaped by avoidance but by recognition. Dad ran a hand over his jaw, a weary gesture. "Why didn't you say this sooner?" "Because every time I tried," I answered, "I got a solution instead of a conversation." He looked at me then, really looked. Mom sat down as if her legs couldn't carry the weight of the new understanding settling into her bones. "I don't want to choose out of fear," I continued. "Not love, not marriage, not anything. I want to choose because it feels right. Because I feel right." Mom whispered, "We should have listened." This time the apology wasn't defensive or rushed. It was simply true. We all stayed still for a moment, letting the honesty breathe between us. Mom's shoulders trembled slightly as she whispered, "I didn't know the chair meant that much." "It wasn't the chair," I said. "It was the pressure beneath it. The message I kept hearing. But I'm behind. That something's missing in me." Dad's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "You're not behind, Claire. We shouldn't have made you feel that way." I nodded once, grateful for the words even if they came later than I wished. Mom reached toward the table, her fingers brushing its surface like she was smoothing out wrinkles no one else could see. "We won't do that again," she murmured. I didn't need perfection, just the willingness to understand. For the first time all night, Mom lifted her eyes to meet mine without flinching. There was a new softness in her gaze. Not pity, not worry, but acknowledgement. "You want a life that feels like yours," she said. "Yes," I replied. "One I'm not rushing into. One I'm not performing for anyone." Dad exhaled deeply, almost as if he'd been holding his breath through the entire dinner. "We'll give you the space. We should have done that from the start." The sincerity in his voice landed gently. I felt something in my chest unclench. Not fully, but enough to let warmth seep in. Mom reached for a napkin to wipe her eyes, hands shaking but deliberate. "We want to know you," she said softly. "Not just the version we hoped you'd become." The three of us stood in the kitchen, wrapped in the kind of fragile honesty families rarely allow themselves to touch. The light above us swayed faintly, casting a soft shimmer across the table. A reminder that even familiar spaces could shift, breathe, change. Mom looked at me like she was seeing her daughter, not a timeline. Dad stood steadier now, as if understanding had finally found a place to settle in him. I inhaled, letting the air fill me in a way it hadn't for years. Nothing was magically fixed, but something had cracked open, quietly, deeply, necessarily. And standing there with them, I felt the early contours of healing forming in the space we had finally cleared. When I finally stepped back into my apartment, Piper greeted me with a soft chirp, weaving around my ankles like she sensed the emotional static clinging to me. I sank onto the couch, exhaling a breath that felt older than the evening itself. Piper climbed onto my lap, settling with the kind of trust only animals seem to master. For a while I just sat there, stroking her fur and letting my thoughts drift. Tonight hadn't been easy, but for the first time, I hadn't shrunk. I hadn't reshaped myself to fit someone else's comfort. The quiet of my apartment felt different, less like solitude, more like space. A space that belonged to me, shaped by me, answering only to me. Piper nudged my hand, and I realized she was right here, tethering me to a gentler reality. I walked over to the window and cracked it open. The neighborhood outside was calm, washed in the soft glow of streetlights. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed. Light, unburdened. Life moved on, steady and indifferent, and that felt oddly comforting. I leaned my elbows on the sill, letting the cool air brush my face. Everything in me felt stretched thin but clearer, like the aftermath of a long cry that leaves your vision sharper. I didn't regret anything I'd said. If anything, I regretted waiting this long to say it. The silence between my parents and me had been accumulating for years, packing itself into corners until tonight finally forced it out into the open. And even though the truth had shaken us, I could feel the ground settling beneath it. I returned to the couch and pulled a blanket around me, the familiar weight grounding me. There was no triumph in what happened, no sense of winning, just a quiet understanding. I had done what needed to be done. I reached for my phone and scrolled through an old playlist I hadn't listened to in a while. Soft, melancholy melodies filled the apartment like a warm tide. Music always had a way of making emotions feel less jagged, more breathable. I rested my head on the back of the couch, letting the notes seep into me. Some wounds don't sting when they're exposed, they exhale. That's what tonight felt like, an exhale years in the making. Later, I made myself a quick bowl of noodles, a simple, comforting ritual. The steam curled upward in lazy spirals, warming the air around me. I sat on the sofa to eat, cross-legged, the way I used to as a teenager when life felt simpler and the world seemed less interested in rushing me. The noodles tasted a little too salty, maybe from the tears I hadn't realized were still drying on my cheeks. But there was something tender in the small, ordinariness of the moment, cooking for myself, feeding myself, taking care of myself. No expectations, no scrutiny, just me, in my own time, in my own rhythm. After washing the dishes, I lit a small candle on the coffee table. Its warm glow flickered softly, casting gentle shadows on the walls. The apartment felt still, but not empty. I sat there, hugging my knees, and thought about everything that had unfolded. The confrontation wasn't an ending. It wasn't a rupture beyond repair. It was simply a truth laid bare between three people who loved each other but forgot how to show it. Healing wouldn't be instant. It never is. But I felt something in me soften at the thought that maybe, just maybe, they were finally willing to meet me where I stood, instead of where they wished I'd be. I curled into the corner of the couch, the candlelight warm against my skin. Piper settled beside me, her tiny heartbeat steady and reliable. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of the day settle in a place that felt manageable instead of overwhelming. Tonight had cracked something open, not in a way that broke us, but in a way that let air in. That thought eased the edges of my exhaustion. I closed my eyes, letting the soft music and the faint glow around me pull everything into a gentler place. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel caught between who I was and who I was supposed to be. I just felt like myself. Mom's text arrived the next morning while I was pouring cereal. "Can we talk tonight? Kindly, just the three of us." The wording made me pause. My mother rarely used the word kindly unless she meant it, or unless she was afraid she wouldn't be able to hold on to it. I stared at the message for a long moment before replying, "Okay." That evening, when I arrived at my parents' house, the living room felt strangely bare. There were only 3 chairs arranged in a loose triangle, no extra one lingering like a silent opinion. Mom stood near the bookshelf, wringing her hands. Dad adjusted the thermostat even though the temperature was fine. It wasn't tension that filled the room this time. It was something gentler, nervous hope, maybe. We sat, and for the first time in a while, no one looked away. Mom spoke first, though her voice sounded like she was walking across thin ice. "We would like," she said slowly, "to reset, to talk without assumptions." I nodded, surprised by the carefulness in her tone. Dad cleared his throat, then added, "We realized we need to unlearn some things. Old patterns, old expectations." The admission softened something in me. Mom continued, "We don't want you to feel cornered ever again." Her hands knotted together in her lap, a quiet confession of her nerves. I listened, feeling a cautious warmth spread through my chest. They weren't perfect with their words, but they were trying. Trying in a way I hadn't seen since childhood, when problems could still be fixed with honesty instead of fear. "I'm not asking you to stop caring," I said. "I just need the kind of care that leaves room for me to breathe." Mom nodded so quickly it almost startled me. "Yes, of course. We want that too." Dad leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his expression earnest. "We need to trust you more. Trust that you're building your life, even if it doesn't look like what we imagined." His honesty landed gently, loosening a knot inside me I didn't know I'd been clenching. Mom added, "And we want you to tell us when we slip. Not later. Not after it builds up." I exhaled, realizing how long I'd been holding my breath without noticing. This wasn't the dramatic confrontation from days before. This was quieter, humbler. A beginning carved from the willingness to change. Dad shifted in his seat, then looked at me with a sincerity I wasn't used to seeing from him. "I've been thinking about last night," he said. "About how you said silence can hurt too." His gaze drifted downward, as if ashamed. "I've spent a lot of my life avoiding conflict. It felt easier. But I can see now how that made you feel alone." I swallowed the sudden sting in my throat. Mom rested a hand gently on his arm, grounding him. He continued, "We don't want to be parents who make you shrink just to be heard." The sentence hung in the air, soft but heavy. For a moment, none of us spoke. I reached for his hand, not tightly, just enough for him to know I heard him, and that I believed him. When the conversation eased, no one rushed toward a conclusion. The silence that followed wasn't sharp or wounded. It felt like letting air into a room that had been closed for too long. Mom finally said, "We love you, Claire. Not the version we worried about. You." Dad nodded slowly beside her. I felt something warm swell in my chest, not overwhelming, just steady. "I know," I whispered. "I never doubted that. I just needed it to feel less conditional." Mom's eyes softened with a kind of clarity that made her look both older and younger at the same time. She didn't speak again. She didn't have to. The quiet between us said enough. When the meeting ended, Dad walked me to the door. The porch light above us flickered as he opened it, casting a soft shimmer across the entryway. "Drive safe," he said, squeezing my shoulder gently. There was something new in his voice, something steady, something that mirrored the effort he had promised inside. Mom stood behind him, offering a small, hopeful smile. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own family. I stepped into the cool night air, feeling the shift settle around me. Not everything was solved, not everything was healed, but tonight they had met me halfway. And for now, that was enough. Wednesday had me over for dinner a few nights later. The message was simple and unadorned. Just dinner, no surprises. I arrived to find her in the kitchen chopping vegetables at a pace that suggested equal parts concentration and nerves. "Thought I'd try that new recipe you sent me," she said without looking up. Her voice held no edge, no underlying prompt, just an attempt. I joined her at the counter, slipping into the rhythm of her movements. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was careful. Like two people learning the steps to a new dance after years of doing the same one. The kitchen felt different this time. Not a stage for expectations, but a place where we might relearn each other. Mom handed me the bowl of flour and asked, very earnestly, "Do I whisk this now?" I stifled a laugh. "Not yet. Let me show you." She leaned in, determined, but the moment I demonstrated, she accidentally flipped flour onto her shirt. Her gasp was so dramatic I burst out laughing. She joined me, the sound coming out in an unsteady but genuine wave. It was the first time in weeks, maybe months, that we'd laughed together without the laughter carrying something sharp underneath. As we mixed and stirred, she asked small questions about my job, my latest projects, even Piper. Questions that weren't coded or leading, It surprised me how much I'd missed this version of her, the one who was curious instead of controlling. The dough wasn't coming together the way the recipe promised, and Mom looked mortified as she held up a lopsided blob. "I swear it looked normal in the video," she muttered. "It's fine," I said. "Recipes lie, families adapt." She laughed softly. "Is that your way of saying we messed up but it's salvageable?" "Maybe," I said with a shrug. Her eyes lingered on mine a moment too long, carrying a quiet apology woven into the humor. Piper, who I'd brought along because Mom insisted she wanted to bond with her grandcat, wandered into the kitchen and rubbed her head against Mom's ankle. Mom bent down awkwardly to pet her, nearly tipping over the mixing bowl in the process. We both laughed again, lighter this time, freer. When dinner was finally ready, questionably shaped but smelling wonderful, we sat at the table without talking about anything heavier than mild weather complaints and the latest neighborhood gossip. I realized, halfway through the meal, that neither of us had mentioned dating, relationships, or the future. Mom didn't ask, I didn't brace for it. That alone felt like progress. "Tell me about your new client," she said as she passed me the dish. Her tone held genuine interest, not an agenda. I told her about the project, the design challenges, the mood boards. She listened without interrupting, nodding along with the kind of attention that didn't feel performative. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were speaking as two adults, two women, trying to understand, not correct, each other. After dinner, Mom insisted we bake something simple, which ended in her nearly burning her fingertips on the baking tray and me swatting her gently away from the oven mitts. We dissolved into another fit of laughter. Somewhere in that warm, messy kitchen, a small truth surfaced. Maybe this was how we healed, not with apologies alone, but with shared moments that rewrote old patterns piece by piece. As Piper batted at a stray scrap of dough on the floor, Mom said, almost shyly, "I like this. Just us. No expectations." I nodded. Me too. Her shoulders eased visibly, the tension from the last few weeks melting into something softer. We weren't erasing the past, but we were building something new over it, gently, spoonful by spoonful. By the time I was ready to leave, Mom walked me to the door, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. She didn't hug me, not out of coldness, but out of respect for the fragile rhythm we were learning. "Next time," she said, "I'll try a recipe without the internet lying to me." I smiled. "I'll believe it when I see it." Her laugh followed me out onto the porch, small, hopeful, real. As I stepped into the night, I felt the unfamiliar but welcome warmth of something shifting gently in the right direction. Not a dramatic breakthrough, not a fixed relationship, just two people choosing, quietly, deliberately, to meet each other with a little more grace. Dad called a few days later, asking if I could stop by just for a little chat. His tone was softer than usual, almost tentative, and that alone made me curious. When I arrived, he was sitting on the front porch, a pair of old reading glasses perched on his nose, pretending to read the newspaper he wasn't actually turning. He gestured to the chair beside him. "Thought we could sit out here," he said. "Feels easier to talk when the air is moving." I settled beside him, watching the quiet neighborhood evening stretch out before us, neighbors watering lawns, a dog barking in the distance, the sky settling into a muted gold. Dad folded the newspaper, placed it on his lap, and said nothing for a long moment. It was the kind of silence that felt purposeful, not awkward. Finally, he exhaled, slow and steady. "When I was your age," he began, "your grandfather wanted me to take over the family business." I blinked, surprised. Dad almost never talked about his early adulthood, especially not with this much vulnerability. He said it was secure, he continued. Sensible. Promising. A tired smile tugged at his mouth. I hated it. I looked at him fully, realizing I had never heard this story. I wanted to study carpentry, he said. Build things with my hands. But when I mentioned it, he said I was throwing my life away. His voice tightened, not with anger, but with a long-stored ache. And so, he said quietly, I did what he wanted. I folded. The admission slipped into the air like a truth he had been waiting years to set down. I felt the weight of his words settle between us, warm and heavy. Dad, I said softly, I didn't know. He nodded. I didn't want you to. I always thought, if I said it out loud, you'd see how I resented it. And I didn't want resentment to be something I passed down. He rubbed his thumb slowly across the newspaper's edge. But when I saw your face the other night, he added, I realized I'd already been passing it down in other ways. I let the moment breathe. There's something tender about watching a parent step out from behind the walls you didn't know they'd built. I pushed you with silence, he said. Your mother pushed you with words. Different methods, same harm. His honesty was a softness I didn't expect. Without overthinking it, I let my head rest briefly on his shoulder. He froze, just for a moment, then relaxed, the gesture landing in a part of him that had clearly missed this closeness. I don't want to repeat what happened between me and my father, he said. I don't want you to carry what I carried. I closed my eyes, letting his voice settle like warm gravel in my chest. You're not repeating it, I whispered. Not anymore. He gave a small, shaky laugh. Well, I sure tried. I nudged him gently with my elbow. Trying to fix it counts too. The porch light flickered above us, painting soft shadows across his face. He looked older in that moment, but truer, too. We sat there a while longer, letting the evening breeze move through the stillness. Cars passed. A kid biked by. Someone's wind chime rang faintly down the block. Ordinary sounds, grounding us back in the softness of the present. Dad finally said, I want you to know something. I'm proud of you. Not for what you've done or haven't done. Just you. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I turned toward him, blinking back the sudden warmth gathering behind my eyes. Thank you, I said. You don't know how much that means. He nodded slowly, as though committing himself to saying it more often. I'll learn, he said. It may take time. I may mess up, but I'll learn. It was the kind of promise that felt lived in, not rehearsed. As I stood to leave, he walked me to the door the way he did when I was younger. Slow, steady, present. Let us know if you want to come for dinner, he said. But only if you want to. No expectation, no timeline, just an open door. I smiled, feeling something settle inside me, something warm, like a boundary that no longer needed guarding so tightly. Dad rested his hand briefly on the doorframe, watching me with a softness I couldn't remember seeing before. You're steering your own life, he said, and I'm glad. Those words followed me all the way to my car, echoing in a place that had long waited to hear them. For the first time, the future felt wide, without feeling heavy. That weekend, I took myself out for breakfast, a small diner tucked between a laundromat and a flower shop. I chose a booth by the window, the kind with vinyl seats that squeak when you slide into them. The sun poured in lazily, warming the table, and for once, I didn't mind the quiet around me. I ordered pancakes, coffee, and nothing else. It felt strange at first, sitting alone by choice rather than circumstance. But then the waitress refilled my cup with a soft smile, and the world hummed around me, forks clinking, newspapers rustling, someone whispering into a phone. And I realized something gentle had shifted inside me. I wasn't waiting for anything. Not permission, not validation, not another voice to fill the silence. I was simply here, present in my own company, and it didn't feel empty. It felt like breathing for the first time in months. After breakfast, I wandered into the flower shop next door. The air smelled like eucalyptus and wet soil, grounding and fresh. An older woman behind the counter asked if I needed help choosing something, but I shook my head and drifted slowly through the aisles. The bouquets weren't extravagant, just modest arrangements wrapped in brown paper. My hand paused over a small bunch of pale yellow tulips. They weren't showy or symbolic. They were just soft, kind. I bought them without thinking, cradling them on the walk home like they were something fragile and worth tending. Once inside, I placed them in a glass jar on my kitchen table. The sight of them, quiet, bright, unapologetically simple, filled the room with a kind of peace I didn't know I'd been craving. Piper hopped onto the table, sniffing the tulips cautiously, before settling into the chair opposite mine. I laughed softly. Good, I needed someone to admire them with me. She blinked as if approving. I sat down and let myself be still. Not scrolling, not planning. Just sitting, letting the soft hum of my apartment wrap gently around me. For the first time, I could feel the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness pressed in. Solitude opened up. And right now, everything in me felt open. Open in a way that didn't ache. Open in a way that felt like I'd made space. Not for someone else, but for myself. The kind of space you don't realize you've been missing until it finally appears. Later, I took a slow walk through the neighborhood. The kind of meandering stroll you only take when you're not rushing toward or away from anything. Kids rode bikes along the sidewalk. A man washed his car with music playing from a tinny speaker. Life unfolded around me without urgency. I passed a small community bulletin board outside the grocery store. A flyer caught my eye, bright blue with hand-drawn doodles advertising a pottery class starting next month. I pulled down one of the tear-off tabs. It felt impulsive, but not reckless. More like a step toward a version of myself I'd forgotten to meet. A version that created for the sake of creating, without wondering who might judge or approve. As I tucked the paper into my pocket, I felt something spark. Quiet, but alive. When I got home, there was a voicemail from Mom. Not long, not heavy. Just a simple message. Hope you're having a good weekend. No pressure to call back. Just wanted to say I love you. I listened twice, surprised by how steady she sounded. No undertones, no agenda, just love. Simple, uncluttered, sincere. I didn't call back right away. Not to create distance, but to savor the feeling of a boundary that no longer stung. Instead, I sat on the couch with Piper curled beside me, letting the soft cadence of my mother's voice echo in a gentler part of me. For once, it didn't trigger defensiveness. It settled like something warm, something earned. As evening drifted in, I lit a candle and opened my windows to the cool breeze. The tulips swayed slightly on the kitchen table, their pale petals catching the faint light. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, breathing in the calm that had settled over my home. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, no sweeping revelation or cinematic conclusion, just a quiet shift, subtle but unmistakable, like a door inside me opening an inch wider. I wasn't healed, but I was learning to inhabit myself differently. And for now, that was enough. More than enough. On Wednesday morning, I received a text from Harold. Community garden needs volunteers this weekend. No pressure. Just come if the soil calls you. I smiled at the phrasing. Only Harold could make manual labor sound like a spiritual retreat. I hadn't seen him since the infamous dinner, but the memory of him sitting politely in that too-small chair still made my chest warm with quiet gratitude. After a moment, I typed back, "I'll come by." When Saturday arrived, I walked to the garden behind the community center. Rows of raised beds glowed under the early sun, and a handful of volunteers worked with quiet focus. Harold spotted me from across the lot, waving with exaggerated enthusiasm, as if I'd traveled from another planet just to greet him. "Look who finally answered the call of the soil," he said. I laughed. It felt good, simple, honest, unweighted. We worked side by side, pulling weeds and loosening soil. Harold narrated everything like a nature documentary. And here we observe the elusive dandelion, pretending it belongs. The other volunteers chuckled, clearly used to his commentary. I let the rhythm of the work settle into me, the scrape of the spade, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bird cutting across the morning air. There was something soothing about tending to something that grew on its own terms. No timelines, no expectations. Just sunlight, dirt, and care. At one point, Harold paused and said quietly, "You look lighter." I shrugged, brushing soil from my palms. "Maybe I am." He nodded as though confirming something he already believed. "Good," he said. "Life should feel lived, not managed." After we finished watering the seedlings, Harold motioned toward a small bench shaded by a young maple tree. We sat, the wood warm beneath us. He sipped from a thermos and handed me a second one. "Tea," he said. "Mint. Calms the nerves, unsettles the stubborn." I raised an eyebrow. "Which category am I?" "Oh, both," he replied with absolute certainty. I laughed again, feeling the sound settle more naturally this time. He looked at me over the rim of his cup. "You know, your parents care about you in a way that's messy, but not malicious." I nodded slowly. "I know. We're all learning." He tapped his cup lightly. "Learning is good. Means you're not stuck." The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of fresh soil and early summer. It felt like a small, steady promise. Harold told me gossip from the building, the kind that was harmless and oddly comforting. "Mrs. Dalton swears her ficus is depressed," he said. "I told her it's a plant, not a poet." I chuckled, imagining the scene clearly. There was something grounding about Harold's presence. He wasn't trying to fix me, protect me, or shape me. He just showed up, fully, kindly, without agenda. We talked about everything and nothing. The stubborn chill in the mornings, the cat who kept sneaking into the garden, the neighborhood kid who rode his bike too fast, but smiled every time he passed. Ordinary things, human things. And somehow, those things stitched themselves into a kind of quiet comfort I hadn't realized I needed. Before I left, Harold handed me a small packet of seeds. "Marigolds," he said. "Hardy little things. They grow even when you forget to love them." I turned the packet over in my hands. "That sounds like an insult wrapped as gardening advice." He winked. "Maybe." But the gesture settled something warm inside me. There was no pressure in it, just a reminder that growth didn't need to be perfect to be real. As I tucked the seeds into my bag, he added, "Plant them when you're ready. Or don't. They won't take it personally." His smile was soft, almost paternal. Not heavy, not overbearing, just care in its simplest form. Walking home, I felt the gentle weight of the seed packet in my bag with every step. The sky above was soft and clear, the kind of blue that promised an uncomplicated afternoon. For once, I didn't feel caught between who I'd been and who I might become. I just felt here, present, rooted. As I reached my building, Piper's silhouette appeared in the window, her tail flicking like she had been watching for me the whole time. I smiled up at her, feeling a small, steady anchor settle in my chest. Life wasn't suddenly perfect, but it was blooming in quiet, unexpected ways, and I was learning to notice. A few afternoons later, Mom sent a picture. Just a simple snapshot of the dining room. The table was set for 3. Only 3. No empty space waiting to be filled. No silent pressure lingering in the corner. The message beneath it read, "Dinner tonight? No expectations. Just us." I stared at the photo longer than I meant to. Something in my chest loosened again. A soft, almost shy relief. That evening, when I stepped into my parents' house, the first thing I noticed wasn't the table. It was them. Dad standing a little straighter than usual, Mom smoothing her sweater nervously, a small, hopeful smile flickering across her face. The room felt familiar, but not suffocating. Different, but gently so. "We kept it simple," Mom said, motioning to the table. "And honest," Dad added quietly. I nodded, feeling something warm settle deep inside me. Dinner was roast chicken, vegetables, and the soft kind of conversation that didn't require either of us to defend our choices or a brace for impact. Mom asked about my pottery class interest with genuine curiosity, not hidden agendas. Dad listened as I talked about work, chiming in only when he actually had something to add. It felt human, not performative, not orchestrated. Just a family sharing a meal without expecting each other to be anything more than present. At some point, Dad chuckled at something I said, and Mom laughed too. Real laughter, not tight or polite. The sound filled the room in a way that felt like a kind of repair all on its own. Not loud, not exaggerated, just real. Midway through dinner, Mom stood and walked to the hallway closet. She returned with the chair, the same one that had sparked weeks of tension. But now she brought it forward quietly, like she was handling a fragile memory. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "This chair was never the problem. Our fear was." She placed it near the table but didn't pull it out. "I don't want this to represent something missing in your life anymore," she continued. "So I'm putting it where it belongs, with the others. Just a chair, nothing more." Her voice didn't waver. Dad nodded beside her, his expression steady and proud. For a moment, none of us spoke. There was a tenderness in the gesture, a symbolic undoing, not forced, not dramatic, just quietly meaningful. I walked over, tracing the wooden back with my fingers. It felt lighter than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. Like it no longer carried the weight of expectations piling on top of me. Mom watched me cautiously. "We want to start again. Not erase anything, just reset from here," Dad added. "We're learning to see you as you are, not as who we think you should be." I turned toward them, surprised by how deeply the words landed. Something inside me softened, something I didn't even realize had been clenched. I nodded once, slowly. "Thank you," I said. Simple, but true. And for the first time, the chair didn't feel like a judgment. It felt like a bridge. After we cleared the dishes, Mom made tea while Dad dried the plates. The three of us moved around the kitchen with a quiet rhythm, familiar but gentler than before. Mom handed me a mug with both hands, as if offering something fragile. "I know we can't fix everything overnight," she said, "but we can learn, and listen, and trust you." Dad stirred his tea absently. "And if we slip again, just tap us on the shoulder. Don't let us drift." I smiled, touched by the simple, earnest effort. Their love was imperfect, messy, but tonight it didn't feel overbearing. It felt like something being rebuilt, one small, careful piece at a time. Before leaving, I glanced once more at the chair resting beside the table. It blended into the room now, not a threat, not a symbol of failure, just part of the space we all shared. Mom hugged me lightly, not too tight, not too long. Dad squeezed my shoulder with that quiet, steady warmth I recognized from childhood. Walking to my car, I felt the night air settle around me in a way that felt different. Not weighted, not strained. just calm. Inside me, a truth unfolded with soft certainty. Healing didn't always come as a grand moment. Sometimes it came as an ordinary dinner, a reset, a chair finally put in the right place. The next week slipped by in a gentle rhythm, a kind of calm I wasn't used to, soft, unobtrusive, steady. Then Mom called on a Thursday evening just as I was feeding Piper. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her voice didn't sound urgent, just intentional. I wiped my hands and stepped onto the balcony where the night was settling in layers of blue and gold. "What's going on?" I asked. She hesitated, long enough for me to picture her pacing in the kitchen, one hand on her forehead, the other twisting the hem of her shirt. "I didn't realize," she began slowly, "how much I measured your happiness by appearances, by what I thought life should look like." Her honesty hit with a soft, unexpected weight. She wasn't trying to lecture. She wasn't defending herself. She was confessing. "I grew up believing a full table meant a full life," she said. "I thought, if you had the right people sitting around you, you'd never feel lost." I leaned against the railing, watching the windows across the courtyard blink with warm light. "But that was your life," I said gently, "not mine." "I know." Her voice cracked slightly. "I didn't see that. I thought I was helping. I thought I was guiding. But I was pushing you into a shape that wasn't yours." The admission was raw, vulnerable in a way I had rarely heard from her. "Mom," I said softly, "I'm not rejecting the idea of love or companionship. I just don't want it to be a deadline." She exhaled shakily. "That's what I'm learning. Finally." We stayed on the phone, quiet for a moment, both absorbing the shift in the air between us. Then she said something I didn't expect. "You know, seeing you these last few weeks, watching how you're standing on your own, I realized something." I could hear the faint clink of dishes in the background, her hands probably moving out of habit as she spoke. "You're not behind. You're not missing anything. You're choosing. And that's braver than I ever gave you credit for." My throat tightened, a small ache forming beneath my ribs. No dramatics, no guilt. Just truth, finally spoken without fear. "Thank you," I whispered. She breathed out, steadying herself. "Thank you," she said, "for being patient with me even when I didn't deserve it." She went quiet again, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that made room for thought, real thought. Then she added, almost in a whisper, "I'm proud of you, Claire." The words settled into me like warm light, not because I'd been waiting to hear them, but because she'd finally said them without conditions attached. "I want to be better at this," she said, "at seeing you, not the version of you in my head." I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "We'll figure it out," I said. "I know we will." Her certainty surprised me, but didn't scare me this time. It felt earned. It felt like something she was ready to practice, not just promise. Before we hung up, she said, "One more thing." I braced myself. Old habits die hard, but her voice softened. "You don't owe us a life that looks like ours. All we want is for you to feel at home in your own." Something in my chest loosened, fragile and warm. "That means more than you know," I told her. "I'm learning," she said again, as if reminding herself. "Slowly, but I'm getting there." We exchanged a quiet goodnight, and when the call ended, I stood on the balcony for a long time, watching the breeze shift the leaves on the trees below. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like distance between us. It felt like space, healthy, open, generous. Inside, Piper curled up on the couch, blinking at me as if sensing the change in my mood. I sat beside her and let the stillness settle. Life wasn't suddenly perfect. But tonight, something meaningful had clicked into place. A truth spoken aloud. A bridge rebuilt from both sides. Mom had seen me. Not the version she wished for. Not the version she tried to protect into existence. Just me. Steady, imperfect, and enough. And as I leaned back into the cushions, letting the weight of the day dissolve into something quieter, I felt a rare, gentle certainty spreading through me. Love could heal when it learned to listen. And tonight, it finally had. The morning after my call, I woke up before the alarm, sunlight slipping quietly through the blinds. For the first time in a long while, the day didn't feel like something I had to brace myself for. I made coffee, poured it into my favorite chipped mug, and sat by the window, with Piper curled like a comma beside me. Outside, the world was starting its slow, steady hum. Neighbors shuffling out with travel mugs, the rumble of distant traffic, a breeze rippling through the trees. My life wasn't extraordinary by any cinematic measure, but in that moment, it felt entirely mine. Not borrowed, not measured, not compared. Mine. Quiet, imperfect, but fitting in a way I had never let it before. Later that afternoon, I planted the marigold seeds Harold had given me. I kneeled on the small patch of dirt by my building's fence, the sun warming the back of my neck. As I pressed each seed into the soil, I felt a strange tenderness, soft, almost shy. It wasn't about gardening. It wasn't even about Harold. It was about choosing something small and nurturing it simply because it brought me joy. Halfway through, I heard a familiar voice. "I see you've joined the ranks of the dirt worshippers," Harold announced, leaning on his cane like a proud general inspecting a new recruit. I rolled my eyes. "Don't make it weird." He laughed, the warm, low kind that made the air easier to breathe. "Look at you," he said, "growing things." "In a manner of speaking," I replied. His smile said he understood anyway. That evening, Mom sent a photo. 3 steaming mugs of tea on their dining table. Just the mugs. Not staged, not symbolic, just ordinary. Beneath it, she wrote, "Whenever you want to join us, no pressure, just love." I didn't cry, but something soft and warm spread behind my ribs, the way ripples stretch across a still lake long after the pebble sinks. I sent back a picture of the freshly planted soil. "Growing things," I wrote. She replied, "So proud of you." This time the words didn't feel heavy. They felt earned, grounded, quietly real, a version of love that finally knew how to breathe. As the sky shifted into deep shades of blue and lavender, I walked to the small park near my apartment. Families packed up picnic blankets. A couple argued softly near the fountain, then held hands as if apologizing through touch. Everywhere I looked, life moved in imperfect patterns, messy, tender, human. I sat on a bench and let the cool air settle around me. For years, I thought healing meant proving something, becoming someone different, someone more acceptable. But tonight, I realized healing was quieter than that. It was choosing myself without guilt. It was hearing my parents without shrinking. It was letting them learn without carrying the burden for them. It was allowing small joys to matter without needing them to justify anything. A slow, steady reclamation, not a transformation, just a return. On my walk back home, my phone buzzed with a message from Dad. "We're proud of you, not for changing, just for letting us change with you." I paused under a street lamp, the glow soft and warm on the pavement. Once, words like that would have felt like a fragile truce. But now, they settled like something genuine, something offered, not expected. I typed back, "Thank you, truly." Then I slipped my phone into my pocket and kept walking. The night was quiet, but not empty. A car drove by slowly with its windows down, music drifting faintly through the air. A stranger laughed somewhere around the corner. Life pulsed softly all around me, unhurried and unforced. When I reached my apartment, Piper greeted me with her usual indignant meow, as if I'd been gone for years instead of minutes. I scooped her up and pressed my forehead to hers, feeling her tiny heartbeat steady against my chest. Inside, the tulips on the table had opened a little further, their petals stretching gently toward the dim light. I stood there, taking in the simple, quiet beauty of it all. No pressure, no timeline.
No expectations waiting in an empty chair. Just a life, mine, finally expanding at its own pace.
And as I turned off the lights for the night, a soft certainty settled over me. I wasn't late. I wasn't behind. I was exactly where I needed to be. In the end, nothing changed overnight. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic transformations, just small, steady shifts that began to soften the sharp edges between us. My parents learned to love without measuring. I learned to stand without apologizing. And slowly, quietly, we met each other in the middle. Now, when I walk into their home, there's no empty chair waiting to tell me who I should be. Just a table set for who we actually are. Imperfect, learning, choosing each other with a little more grace than before. And as for me, I've stopped rushing toward the version of life I thought I needed to prove. I'm growing things, small things, honest things. A plant on my windowsill, a boundary handled gently. A future that feels like mine, not borrowed. If you've ever felt the weight of expectations, or carried a timeline that didn't belong to you, I hope this story reminded you of something simple. You're not behind. You're becoming. Thank you for listening to my journey. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment and tell me your thoughts. I'd love to hear them. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.